You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players, and all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Everybody, and welcome back to Arsenal Pass, episode 176. This week we're going to be talking about the anatomy of a good aggro deck. We're going to be looking back in the history of Flesh and Blood, as well as talking about the current time, looking at the aggro decks that have sort of dominated the classic constructed meta, or at least made a significant impact, and sort of dissecting what makes a good aggro deck. You might say, what do you mean by good? It's a very subjective term. What makes a fun aggro deck to an extent? Like, what makes it enjoyable to play? That's an aspect. We'll also be talking about what makes them powerful. So, somewhat of an intersection between fun and power. I'm going to be looking back at some of our favorite decks in Flesh and Blood. Definitely some of Hayden's favorite decks. There's a couple in there that I enjoyed as well. Usually not an aggro deck player. And, yeah, obviously you have the boogeyman of the previous format, I guess, to this format to an extent, but also the boogeyman of Living Legend and Blitz to an extent as well in there. So we're going to be going down our list. We'll also probably be joined by the doctor. We got the doctor ringing in. Mr. Tariq Patel will be joining us on the podcast to give his thoughts as well. It's actually his topic, so shout out to Tariq for that. Hayden, how are you doing?
I hope he joins us in that case then. Otherwise, No, it's an interesting topic. Yeah, when you kind of sent it my way, I was like, oh, that is quite an interesting topic because we've had a lot, looking back, right, I was writing up some notes, we've had a lot of aggro decks now at this point where, nearly 15 sets in or whatever it is. A lot of aggro decks and a lot of different aggro decks that operate on sort of different axes in terms of, and we've talked about this before about what is aggro actually in Flesh and Blood. Like, is there truly aggro decks in Flesh and Blood, or should they be categorized more succinctly potentially? Because a lot of these decks you might class as aggro decks are quite different and operate on very different axes to each other. So
yeah, what does aggro even mean, Hayden? When we say aggro, like, if you could give me a definition of aggro in Flesh and Blood, how would you define it as succinctly as possible? You don't have to be completely correct, but if you could give me a sort of concise definition, what would you say?
Does the thing with combat damage as quickly as possible. Usually, basically, the only game plan is to beat the opponent down fast and swiftly. That's what I'd say an aggro deck is.
I think linear game plan is pretty critical, right? It's not doing much adapting to its opponents, more asking the question. But looking at our list here, there are quite a few decks on here that did respond to the question. Weren't always asking the questions. Sometimes we're solving the question.
That's why I think
that's the nature of Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's Flesh and Blood, right? That's why I think aggro sometimes doesn't fit the archetype correctly potentially. So anyway, you asked me how I was. I'm good, very well. Just been playing a bit of Living Legend over the last couple of weeks. Skirmish season kicks off this weekend. Got a couple of Living Legend skirmishes myself. Looking forward to it. Playing a lot of different decks actually. Trying to work out this format. I think it's an interesting format because I think there is a clear best deck to me, and I honestly think it's probably one of the strongest decks we've ever seen in Living Legend, and I think that's sort of causes some challenges with maybe having a more of a diverse format. I would like to see a more diverse format, I think. And I think it might feel like that for the first week or two of Skirmish, but honestly, I just think there is a deck that is so significant. Because we're not going to play it at a super competitive
level. Am I crazy for not knowing what deck you're talking about right now? You're saying that... Okay. Because I feel like he was starting to pull ahead in our conversations in previous podcasts, but, you're saying clear best deck.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Don't get me wrong, there is counters to it. But I think it's hard to play a counter to the best deck in a format that's probably going to be quite open. In terms of, when I say format, I mean events that will be quite open, because skirmish season, store level, a lot of people wanting to play maybe their favorite heroes, things like that. So I think you'll see less of the best deck than probably would be warranted at, say, a tier 3 or higher event. And for that reason, I think it's harder to play some of these counters because some of them have some terrible matchups, to be honest.
Yeah, this Zen being the best deck in Living Legend is particularly funny to me because when we talk about a hero that is currently legal in class constructed, and we think about something like Kano exploiting Living Legend, it makes sense. Kano, it's exploiting people not sort of adapting to it, maybe having the correct slots, and it being a complicated format where people have limited sideboard slots. Zen, on the other hand, I mean, you have a deck that has to look pretty similar to the deck that showed up to U.S. Nationals and won that tournament, being the one that's competing in Living Legend, right?
I mean, it actually looks a little bit different because, well, for one, I mean, obviously there was a ban and suspended announcement since then, but you do have access to 9 bonds, and it's pretty clearly correct to play the 9 bonds. I think it was at the end of the season anyway, before the ban is suspended in CC.
Yeah.
But you also get the support of Stubby Hammers. You get the support of Belittle. So, to be honest, I think it's actually quite significantly more powerful. Even though the base of the deck is quite similar, you can actually lean into the combo even more, I think.
Yeah. I was finding some amusement in a previous screenshot I'd seen on Twitter where our boy Evan, U.S. national champion, was talking to Mr. Yazker on DMs, and Yazker was saying that he doubted the power level of Zen, didn't see it, and the TLDR on that is that was the most powerful deck of all time potentially.
Oh, that's a big call. I don't know what the most powerful deck of all time is. I mean, we saw the impact that Starvo had on the first Living Legend event when everything was unbanned and it went 8 for 8 in top 8.
I think it is Starvo. I think it is Starvo,
sorry.
to be fair.
Yeah.
I think in an unrestricted Flesh and Blood format, everything unrestricted, I think Starvo does pull ahead as the most powerful deck of all time.
I want to know if Briar was unerrated in Living Legend, would it be the best?
Interesting. Yeah, that is also something I hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah.
How did you feel? I mean, I didn't feel particularly amazing about the Briar matchup into Starvo. There was a match at the Indianapolis calling. Sam Dando played into, had top 8 of that event, was playing Briar into Starvo and did decently well. I think outside of that, most of the Starvo metas Briar was looked at as kind of weak.
Yeah, but it was errata during that time, right?
Yeah, I guess it was errata. I'm trying to think. Did there ever exist a time when Starvo was legal and Briar was not errata? No, right?
No, but there did exist times. No, they didn't. But there did exist times where Chain was legal and Briar was unerrated, and honestly, that matchup was pretty close. And
I felt like I didn't like it as the Briar player.
Exactly. Yeah. Even
we would always complain about high rolls, but if I remember correctly, it was like that was what you didn't want to run into. Maybe it was because the mirror felt not 50-50 at the time. I don't know if that was a skill diff or a deck building diff, but the Chain matchup you were not jazzed to see that. I mean, both myself and you were both absolutely juiced by the same player. You got juiced by them at the Orlando calling, and I got
the
juiced
winning
by them
in
at
last
the
round, I think. Yeah.
Cincinnati, my Cincinnati battle hardened run at that time.
It's I think what it shows is just how ridiculous Zen's damage is, to be honest. Because I think honestly, I actually think Briar unerrated doesn't actually touch Zen because Zen's damage is so wide. So it's like, you might get a card, you might get +3 on defense on one card, maybe +2 on another, whatever. But actually, I don't think that's enough. So anyway, I've been trying to come up with some Chain strategies. I really like Chain. I want to play Chain. Have been playing quite a bit of Chain. It's the deck I'd like to play for skirmishes, and I've been coming up with some strategies for Zen, but it is really tough, honestly. Feel pretty good into everything else, though, which is nice.
Interesting. All right, anything in the news this week?
We are heading pretty swiftly towards sort of preview season, I guess, in terms of this new look preview season for Rosetta, which is definitely worth calling out. I actually got an email late yesterday, Brendan.
Oh, did you?
Looks like I got a preview card, so gonna just share that on Twitter. I think it's the 28th of August that I can share that. So haven't seen the card yet, but
you haven't seen it yet.
Haven't seen it.
Interesting.
You want to speculate on what it might be?
What class? It might be a wizard card. Definitely wizard
you think
class.
Wizard? No, not Runeblade.
No. I think that I don't know who does spoilers these days. I'm assuming it's not Brian. So I think that to the sort of collective audience of Flesh and Blood, you are more of a wizard guy than you are a Runeblade guy, because you do have, I believe that you have like the most watched wizard video on YouTube.
Right,
It's
fair enough.
Kano guide. Yeah, it's like I don't know if that's our best video or one of them.
Must be how celebrities feel when they do one thing and they remembered it for the rest of time.
Oh,
Just
man.
that person.
Oh, you just remind me of a a funny phrase that I cannot say on this podcast.
We'll leave it at that. So yeah, Rosetta preview season coming up. This new look preview season. A lot of what you're going to see is going to be mostly at the world premiere, which is coming up very soon in Tampa Bay, Florida. And then we have, what do we have? We have pre-release the first weekend of September, effectively. I'm actually going to miss the pre-release. I'm traveling for work, unfortunately, so I'm missing pre-release weekend, which is a bit lame. Sorry, it's not this first weekend. It's the second weekend, isn't it? Gonna miss pre-release weekend, and then because Tampa Bay's the week before, and then other news. There was a calling in the weekend, calling Manila. Congrats to Gordon Ko, two-time Singaporean national champion, I believe as well. Gordon, very good player. Met Gordy a few times in my travels and at different events. Top dude. Congrats to Gordy for taking it out, winning on Nu over Dash in the final. It's like defensive Dash, making it all the way to the finals. Actually, interestingly. So they've worked something out against Zen that we don't know. You want to go?
Speaking of a top guy, let's huddle around this Barbie and get the command and cookout rolling.
Keep going.
This one's from Storyteller, 1986. Do you associate higher variance / higher ceiling with a higher proportion of one-sided games? If so, I'd be inclined to think that they are not net positive for the game, including regarding player attraction. The reason we fell in love with the game is its tight finishes. Both players at one life battling it out with what's left of their cards / weapons. Losing is always fun then, when you can feel the tension.
So this is a question I took from the pod last week, our YouTube comments. We got quite a lot of comments, I would say, on the pod last week. A lot of questions were around sort of casual player, UPF, people chiming in on that. And then PvE, we talked a bit about PvE, but also talking about, I guess, multiplayer in general. Honestly, it was a lot of what the questions were last week, and then some people shouting at their Living Legend Blitz calls for this upcoming weekend. I think this one's interesting because, I don't know, do you actually associate the higher variance, higher ceiling design philosophy with a higher proportion of one-sided games? I'm not sure that I do, honestly.
I
actually think the opposite.
Not inherently. When you say that, I it's not like I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. No, I don't.
So I use an example, right? I don't think Zen is one of these decks, and that's the deck that maybe people point to in one-sided games at the moment. And honestly, Zen's just consistency because your best card starts on the table. So I'm not sure. Honestly, I'm not sure that it is. So I actually think almost kind of the opposite. I actually think we need like a little acronym for this design philosophy that Brian spoke about on that pod a year and a half ago. Higher variance, higher ceiling. What should we call it? High V, high C. That's what I'm gonna call it, Brendan. It's terrible.
Fire design.
Yeah, that's the magic. I don't like it. Anyway, fun. That's all about fun. Anyway, I think actually what you see a lot of the time is comebacks. Like these kind of epic comebacks, or people being able to feel like they're in the game because they get to do their thing at some point. If they're able to kind of like block out and find the turn, or I mean, you still get one-sided games for sure. Don't get me wrong. You know, the deck doesn't do the thing, but I don't think it's necessarily a higher proportion because I think matchups mattered more prior to a lot of this design coming in. So like specific matchups would be a lot more polarizing. Something that Brendan's talked a lot about that he's not a big fan of is like, you know, the Prism versus Kano matchup, or the aggro deck versus Prism, or whatever. Like these more kind of one-sided matchups. So I actually, just because of matchups purely, just the way they play out, as opposed to this kind of higher variance, higher ceiling kind of design. So
yeah, I would say that's pretty low variance. You're a Kano player, you pair into a Prism.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty low variance, like a low variance interaction, I guess. There's one thing I want to talk about in regards to this question. It was like, it was just a statement. The reason we fell in love with the game was its tight finishes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great topic of conversation for Flesh and Blood because that is why we fell in love with the game. I do think that part of that is out of ignorance. I think Flesh and Blood has a great way of obfuscating games that are already over or potentially one-sided. They make them feel a lot closer than they are, which is not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think as you play the game more, you might see them for what they are. That being said, the design of Flesh and Blood has changed, and I wouldn't say it's like drastically, but to an extent it has changed to include more variance, to include higher ceilings, and you do that at the risk of alienating the player base that is sort of entrenched with your game with trying to attract new players, assuming that's what new players want. I don't know. We don't have time to get in that topic, but I will ask you, Hayden, do you feel like now that we've had you would say arguably a year of this or a year plus of this, how do you feel like it has affected your gameplay experience in Flesh and Blood, this new era of design? You've historically talked about your love for a Tome of Imperial Flame, your love for Kindle, and I'm sure there's more cards that don't come to mind at this moment.
I actually kind of like Kindle, by the way.
Okay, so we've changed our mind on Kindle.
No, I think I like Kindle because I'm not so attached to So the one thing I was really attached to with Dromai was the consistency of game lines and being able to make these decisions with a lower degree of variance and a higher degree of probable outcome. And Tome basically took that away. I think it improved the power level of the deck, but I think it took away what I liked about the gameplay. Whereas with Kano, one of my favorite things is like doing the thing and finding the turn. And I actually think Kindle is more enjoyable for that. So I think it's going to be different for everyone, right? Like in terms of your gameplay experience. And I think that is actually kind of the beauty of it. You asked about my gameplay experience. I think it's honestly dependent on the deck. I mean, what I've probably found is that I've gravitated towards decks where I can find somewhat of I really like consistency in this game. It's one of the things that definitely attracted me to it. And I think, there's been some issues with how powerful consistency is. But I do like kind of interesting consistency in ways to maybe have consistency that leads to branches of decisions. Now, one of the reasons I don't particularly like Zen in the play experience is because it feels very repetitive and the decision. So that's, for instance, let's use 12 petal, right, as your equipment. And then, the traverse 12 petal line, when you block the traverse, you go and find your chi, your flipped chi, transcended chi, and you use it to crack pedal and get the Zen Sage token. That's a really cool play and something I really like about Zen. But that's like something you do very rarely, I would say. And then the flip side of that is literally just block with the with the traverse, go and find your chi and do your big turn. And generally those are the two options. And so I don't find that particularly interesting. Whereas, some other decks where I think you might have consistency, but you leads to a lot of different play lines. One of the things I liked about Dash, honestly, was like, okay, my game plan is for national season. My game plan is revolving around maximum velocity turns. It's revolving around these kind of finding these bigger turns, and then into matchups against like Enigma, I get to play cards like Hanabi Blaster and do some. I'd say there's some consistent lines, but I got to do what I found more interesting things. So I think it depends on the deck. And that's kind of impacted my enjoyment of the format a reasonable amount, to be honest. So, but mostly I've been able to find decks that I enjoy and are still pretty competitive and play them, or at least find competitive ways to play them. So, like, for instance, Living Legend, right? I think Living Legend has now started to creep in with some of this higher variance stuff, or higher power level, but not to the extent of CC, so.
Awesome. Well, if you want to get your question read out on next week's podcast, you can shoot us a comment on YouTube, and we'll get it queued up.
I got one more thing.
The doc.
I got one more thing.
What is the thing? What's the thing?
You asked me what I did last week. I actually went to the cinema with the tall Timmy, who I don't know if you know, but tall Timmy he's dabbling back into Flesh and Blood. He said he played his first games of Flesh and Blood this week.
Is he still tall?
I think he's taller. In fact, yeah, he looks taller because you don't see.
He's been on the juice, eh?
When you don't see something for a while and you're like, oh, it's bigger than I remember. That's the tall Timmy.
Yeah, that happens to me all the time. Like, people mistake it all the time.
We went to the movies with Nick Butcher and Tom Dowling, and we saw Alien Romulus. That was good.
Alien Romulus.
Yeah, good. I enjoyed it.
Okay. Yeah, I might actually go see the movie. Is your recommendation? Thumbs up?
Yeah, I would give it a recommend. It's getting the Hayden Dale Cinema Film Review recommend. It's getting like a nice easy watch recommend, not like a great movie recommend. Yeah.
Okay. Well, shit. We'll see if the tall Timmy makes his way back. And with that, let's bring the doctor in to talk about what makes a good aggro deck in Flesh and Blood. All right, we are joined by Mr. Tariq Patel to talk about what makes a good aggro deck in Flesh and Blood. We have a list here, Tariq, of some of the most dominant aggro decks that have existed in Flesh and Blood, as well as some of the current boogeymen that are running around in both Class Constructed and Living Legend. I had Hayden already define for me earlier in the podcast, but I'm gonna have him. I want you to say that definition again, just for Tariq, so we can see if he agrees on what do we mean when we say aggro in Flesh and Blood.
Does it have to be verbatim?
No, you can change your mind.
I think I said it's a deck that does the thing primarily with combat damage. I think we said linear game plan, fairly one-dimensional a lot of the time, tries to race down the opponent as fast as possible. I think that's mostly what we said.
Ask the question, yeah. Usually does not respond to the question.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's a deck that primarily is attacking, very little blocking, and it wants to go forward. It's never really wanting to play a mid-range game plan unless it's forced into it by a non-hit. So, yes, I agree with Hayden.
Boom.
All right, Hayden, I want you to start running, start with your list. Start breaking out the different types of aggro decks for us in terms of, using examples for real heroes that have existed in Flesh and Blood.
Well, I think Oh, can I say one thing first of all for Tariq? Because we talked about this, and I feel like Tariq wasn't on this part of the call pod. One thing we talked about when it comes to aggro decks and Flesh and Blood, right? Is aggro even a good name? Because there's so many different ways you can play aggro decks. Like there's aggro decks with on hits. There's aggro decks with disruption. Thinking Lexi. There's aggro decks that have just pure damage. There's aggro decks that have multipliers. There's combo aggro decks. Like, is it even a good term?
Yeah, it's hard. We like as humans to put things in boxes, but Hayden's right. Aggro is a very catch-all term that we use, and it probably is a little bit more nuanced when we kind of get into it. To me, aggro is broken up into different flavors in Flesh and Blood. We have the go wide aggro decks that ninjas typically present, something like Katsu, Fi. Katsu maybe a little bit more combo aggro, but Fi and Zen primarily are the go wide aggro decks. They're purely damage based. In my head, the other end of that spectrum is Gold Tall aggro decks. Dash and what used to be Earthbriar come to mind. Decks that try and put like 7 damage tall and then 4 damage just in 2 different attacks. And then the combination of the two, which is like combo aggro decks like Katsu, trying to bring a bunch of different cards together to get effects that are greater than their equal parts. And then on hit aggro, which I think Lexi kind of falls into. Azalea, you can kind of put into that category. So I think there's like 4 different types of aggro decks that functionally exist in Flesh and Blood, and all of them are very unique in how they're approached. So when we're talking about aggro decks, specifically ones that I don't like, I really mean one subset of aggro, not the overall theme.
Interesting. Can I guess which subset it is?
Go ahead.
Combo aggro.
No, I actually don't mind combo aggro. It's the linear aggro decks specifically that I really dislike the play pattern too.
Okay. Well, can I ask you one follow-up question? Because we also spoke about this. Do you think, first of all, is Zen a combo aggro deck? And then second of all, is it also and a linear combo aggro deck?
It's combo in the sense that it takes a combination of cards to get a big turnoff, like flipping a chi with a blue card. But it's linear in the way that it plays out. There's no on-hit effects. What I mean by linear is the decisions are usually unilateral. It's usually only on Zen to make the decision on when to give the helmet, when to transcend, and then when to go all in. Your opponent doesn't get to choose when to block, to deny an on hit, or do anything like that. It's purely numbers being thrown at them, and if their numbers are better than yours, then they're ultimately going to lose.
Bonds as well. Bonds lines are pretty linear. As much as people go, oh, you get to do the cool things with bonds. It's the same thing. You do the same thing every time.
The murky waters of what is and what is not combo reminds me of my favorite combo deck in Flesh and Blood. Old him combo. You combo all your cards together and they fatigue. Bro, combo's an even worse word than aggro. Combo is just not. Like, dude, the combo is. We don't have to get into this, but the English language cannot define the vast permutations of what is and what is not combo.
I'll call them pop-off decks then. How about that?
Sure. Sure.
All right. You wanted Tariq to talk about aggro decks?
Mm-hmm.
Specifically heroes?
Well, let's start with the heroes. Let's go deeper into those archetypes. So I want to talk about Lex. Let's go ahead and talk about Lexi first. Just break down more what defines this sort of on-hit aggro, some of the gameplay patterns, like what it's trying to do and how it differs from the others. I know you give us a quick synopsis there, but if you can dive in deeper into specifically what Lexi did that made Lexi so powerful in the metagames in which it dominated.
So what I think made Lexi both really, really good as an aggressive deck, but also really fun, and I think one of the healthiest aggro deck that Flesh and Blood has had, is that its decision making was put in both players' hands. One, you still had to sequence your cards and which arrow to play, which to block with, when to give them ice tokens. It had a lot of decision points to play from the aggro side. But it also gave your opponent a lot of equity in which arrow to block. Am I blocking the Heat Seeker? Am I blocking the Blood Rot arrow? And in that sense, they could play a very defensive back and forth mid-range game against Lexi a lot better than, say, Zen, where it's like, my only really decision is, do I block 2 cards on this 5 and potentially lose out on the damage later on if you present a 6 attack, or some like 1 or 2 damage calculation. It never really threatened to ponder token, a frostbite, a frailty, or any of those kind of on hits that Lexi did. And I think the important difference is as we saw in the Lexi format progress over time, even mirror matches started coming down to fatigue. I think the runaways towards the end were like signing out Rain Razors, even though mathematically that card was often zero mana or 0 resource, 1 card 6. They were oftentimes taking out because they just wanted to block better and present a fat deck and get to the end game. I might be summarizing their game plan simply, but their games would often go to fatigue. I played against Brody in Dallas, I believe the calling, and our match basically went to fatigue where he won by I think exactly 1 or 2 cards. So the margins were that small towards the end, and it actually went to a fatigue game plan. And one of the reasons Dromai did so well into it is because Dromai blocked the on hits well, let the vanilla quote unquote damage through, and then was able to take tempo with dragons and play a good game plan into that. With Zen, right, if you were to bring Dromai back into this format, it would just get completely run over because it would have no option to gain value through blocking. It would just simply block 3 to 6 damage a turn and then just get steamrolled by going wide. And to me, that defines, an on-hit aggro deck versus a linear aggro deck is where did the equity in the decisions lie? In the blocking or on both players' side or just in the attacker's side?
I really like that. I think you can even, I fully agree. It's one of my biggest call-outs between the two. I think you can go even one step further to say something like Lexi, because of the differences, the variances in some of the outcomes, the game plans. It also led to differences in deck building and metagame evolution when Lexi was in the format. Even at its peak, so post-Codex, Lexi went through different iterations of what it looked like based on what decks were trying to attack in the format, how they were trying to attack it, what the mirror match looked like. Whereas some of these linear decks, to me, feel like they only ever evolve to their peak form. They don't evolve based on what's happening necessarily around them, really. Like, you're like, what's the best 60 cards? And then I'll throw some cards in the sideboard for a matchup, maybe. Blanche.
Well, let's talk about combo aggro. You didn't mention chain, but do you feel like chain falls in combo aggro, like that archetype?
Yeah, combo aggro is a very like esoteric term. I'm not even sure it means anything like tempo. Like what the hell does tempo? What the hell does combo aggro mean? In my head, combo aggro just means like you use more than just your 4 cards to create an effect that's greater than what's on board. So dash would be an example of a combo aggro deck. Even putting items into play, trying to get a greater effect on a later term. Something that's not just play the cards in my hand, try and add up the damage and maximize value.
Yeah.
Yes, so in that sense, chain would definitely be a combo aggro deck. You're oftentimes taking a loss on certain turns by playing a time snap potion, knick-knack bric-a-brac, or like anything else to maybe set up more damage later on down the line, especially if you're playing against a fatigue deck. Dash in the same way will oftentimes give up equity in a turn cycle to get a second chamber or play a backup protocol red or a boom grenade or something like that in order to hit them with like a 6 or 7 card hand. But combo aggro decks could also be called mid-range aggro decks. Like that would also probably be an acceptable term because there's like a blocking attacking pattern to it. So I don't know if there's a right word for it, but it definitely mid-range combo aggro deck. Yes, I would put chain in that category.
Yeah, I think that chain often finds himself taking opportunity costs of pitching cards that could help your hand facilitate more damage on this turn in order to deal more later in the game for some sort of end game scenario, whether you're coming off on a single turn or just a series of turns at the end to sort of beat a fatigue based strategy. But I think that's very common for chain. Chain also, as an aggro deck, is also utilizing often more than 4 cards in the hand. Sort of has this card advantage that's based off the hero, which I thought was particularly interesting. It's interesting because, like you mentioned with Lexi going to fatigue in some of those matchups, I'm trying to think about chain. A lot of these aggro decks, do they have the ability? Do you think the aggro decks, or what you define as aggro decks in Flesh and Blood, often have the ability to pivot to other game plans, or are they usually pigeonholed into one? Because I'm tossing up between a lot of these heroes. Like, are they usually just have that one linear game plan, or just asking the question, or do they have the ability to sort of adapt on the fly?
It depends. If they're purely linear and they don't have much block value like most ninjas, then they're really all in on just kind of damaging your opponent. You can fatigue by damage is a term that we kind of like to use in our testing sessions, where you're forcing your opponent to block so much. Like maybe their primary game plan is to block you out, but just you throw good numbers at them, and then you get to an end state where you're able to repeatedly use a weapon and then fatigue them. But it feels like it comes up naturally as a part of the game, your natural game plan of attacking them, where you don't really have like a natural fallback plan. It's not like I go into a game with Zen being like, I'm going to fatigue this Victor opponent. But if the Victor opponent is like continuously over blocking, sometimes it can reach that state. In my Nationals top 8 match, actually, the one that I lost, I got triple pummeled over the course of, I think, 2 turns. But if that turn hadn't happened, I was actually thinking that the game might have gone to fatigue end state because I think we both had something close to 20 something cards in our deck. I was almost out of reds, and we were both at pretty healthy life totals. And I was already thinking, okay, I have to start prioritizing my weapon a little bit more just to kind of, in case it gets to that like really, really late end game. But it was definitely not something I thought of like, oh, I'm going to fatigue this Victor when I sat down and played against him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about Briar as well. In terms of can you just dive more into Briar, that would fall into which archetype? Is that the go wide aggressive deck? I mean, this obviously post errata Briar, I would assume as well.
Yeah, Briar's definitely a go wide / go tall aggro deck. It kind of presented it in chunks. There was some mid range play to it because you did play certain on hits like Snatch, and then some people could argue the on hit embodiment would provide enough incentive for people to block your attacks out. But by and large, it was a linear aggro deck. And if I were to encompass it a little further, I had a friend who went to Gen Con, so I got these like what are they called, the first strike decks, and I've been playing them a little bit, trying to teach my fiance how to play Flesh and Blood. And I was telling Matt earlier because we're going to the Calling in Tampa for the world premiere that one of my biggest worries heading into the post format is Aurora, the new Runeblade hero. If she's aggressively slanted, she's either going to be completely broken or unplayable because the way that linear aggro decks impact the metagame is Zen's output is so good that if I were to play any other aggro deck, it would have to be better. And if it's better, then it's just going to be completely absurd. And if the math is just worse, then why am I really playing anything else?
Yep.
Yeah, so it either passes the test or it doesn't, and there's no reason to be in second place there. You just have the deck that has the highest numbers, or you don't.
That's
Yeah, I think
kind
we've
of
seen
what I
that
think's
before
problem
as
with
well.
Living Legend right now as well. To be honest, is like, why do you play the aggro deck that isn't Zen in Living Legend right now? I think is like maybe it's to beat Icelander if you think Icelander is favored into Zen or Ultim into Zen, whatever. But I think it's always been the question when there's been a significant, honestly, in any, I don't know, maybe Tariq, you disagree, but any aggro deck, often there's a clear best aggro deck, and there's not often a lot of reasons to play other aggro decks. Like even when Lexi was in the format, right? It did so many things so well, or it could do so many things so well. What was your reason to play another aggro deck? There wasn't a particularly hyper aggressive linear aggro deck, I think, in that format, really, right? So I don't know. I feel like most formats there's been a clear best aggro deck, and a lot of the time it's come down to damage, but some other times it hasn't. It's come down to, its flexibility, its ability to present its own on-hit effects or own questions that need to be blocked out that isn't just pure damage, or the way that it interacts with other aggro decks.
Yeah, no, it's a valid point. I think it's more pronounced when the decks are like very linear and there's not a lot of maneuverability or
Yeah.
play to it. Because, for example, Runeblade will offer, tricky or evasive damage in the source of Arcane through Rune Chance, and that could be a reason to play it if there was like a strong disruptive defensive deck in the format, like a Guardian or so forth. It would be a reason to play it over a linear aggro deck like Ninja. Lexi, to be fair, in that format, Mara Ferris, I think, found the other really good aggro deck in Redline Dromai. Like, that was an acceptable other deck in that format to be playing. But yeah, in a large part, when decks are just so mathematically good and they don't really give back and forth play, it's purely like, here's my math, then your options as the opponent are either one, to play an extremely disruptive deck like New or Azuri, like we saw at the last PT, or kind of try and find a better aggro deck or play something else like really in left field like Prism, where maybe you're doing something else so powerful that it doesn't really care about whatever aggro deck's game plan.
Yeah.
Interesting. So in terms of like a gameplay experience, do you think that linear aggro decks are in a kind of a touchy spot because they either, I don't know, they're either the math is good enough where it's sort of adapt or die, play something disruptive, or just sort of fold to the damage, or they're just maybe not good enough? Is there like a healthy middle ground for these type of decks?
Well, I think every once in a while it'll be fun to get back to this. I think it was a really good place to start Flesh and Blood, right? Like nuts and bolts. Like, this is damage. We've done this before. Like this is damage. This is how you do it. You go wide, you attack. And I think that was healthy, 2 years ago when we first got Fi, because it was the first time like a ninja kind of just like put stuff out there. it makes sense to play. My girlfriend picked up 5 very easily. She picked up Zen very easily. Rune Blades, a little bit trickier to kind of teach her with. So it's really good to kind of get people into the game. But too much of that is a little bit repetitive, and it wears on people, especially when they want to do something else and they're just getting completely run over. So in that sense, yes, it creates repetitive gameplay that might not be viewed well. But every once in a while, like I'm sure if we went to an on-hit aggro deck with lots of disruption for a while, it's a good break. And that's why I don't mind it so much. Like we had like 2 years of ice almost, and then we come back to go wide aggro. And this back and forth, people were complaining and sick of Lexi, and they were complaining and sick of Icelander, and now everybody's like, oh, I wish I had ice again. I'm like, no, you don't. You don't remember what it was like to be channeled like frigid for 3 turns while I'm just hitting you with like arrows, and so people forget. And then so I think having a balance of it is still okay. There's a place for this stuff. But.
I think the main challenge is that linear aggro decks, if you take something like Zen right now, the biggest challenge is traverse. I think that's the biggest piece, is that I think linear aggro decks are fine. I actually think Fi, you shout out Fi, I think is a great example of what a linear aggro deck can look like, and have some interesting sort of, a bit more interesting game patterns, have this almost glass cannon approach in some ways sometimes. If I think back to, I mean, it was reasonably, it blocked, like, it could block reasonably well. People built it that way, but it was interesting. Like, people could build it in different ways. I don't feel like it's the case as in, because you start with your best card on the table in Traverse, and your games look repeatedly pretty similar. And that could be a symptom of the format as a whole in terms of the other decks that are currently available and the total power level. But maybe it's more on Traverse. I'm not actually 100% sure.
Can I take a second to address this? Because I've seen this opinion a lot on Twitter, and I've heard it week in and week out on various things. And I don't want to say I disagree, but I think the problem is more rooted in Zen's kit than it is the card itself, because both New and Enigma both have access to Traverse, right? And it's not an extremely problematic card. Obviously, it's extremely good in Enigma when you line it up with Miragai, but that is like part of the combo of playing Enigma, where you're getting an additive effect. And it's cool because you usually have to take an L, because transcending and then playing a Spectre Shield is usually like kind of mid on math, and then you get the value back later in the game. And it's okay in Enigma. And in New, 90% of people don't play it. We played it at the PT for a very specific niche reason in the mirror, but they're not a problem in the other two archetypes. I personally believe the problem is rooted in the kit of Zen, where Zen's ability is quite literally demonic tutor, make a card in hand for Art of War. So like, to me, the problem is rooted in the kit of Zen's design and not so much Traverse itself. And I really worry, because I think Traverse is an extremely fun card. Like, having equipment that changes the utility of your hand, that lets you play a little bit differently than the 4 cards you draw every turn, is extremely fun and good gameplay, because it lets people build the things, lets people customize on the fly, and it gives that agency, there's that word, that people like in games. And if we start pinning the problem on Traverse, maybe LSS is going to look at it and go, all right, we can never do anything like this ever again. And it goes back to, my equipment just blocks 2 vanilla, and that's kind of like whatever. I think if Zen's ability was a little bit different, it probably would have been okay. But that's okay. This is where it goes back a year ago, where we're all complaining about, the power level of Flesh and Blood's too low, this and that. When they experiment with stuff, sometimes they're going to miss on the high side. And I think people doing powerful things is still okay for a little bit. You're going to have people whining, but I'd rather them do this and miss on the high side than
Bright lights.
I mean, I like bright lights, but yes, bright lights for you.
No,
Right.
I just want to say I completely agree. I think it's so obvious about Traverse. Like, here's another example that I think talks to that. Bloodshade Skelata and Sonata Arcanix, I think, is the other kind of.
Yeah, totally fine
comparison
cards. So, like, yeah.
I like those equipment. I agree. I want those kind of equipment in the game, but they have to be paired in the right ways.
Which they were, and they were unjustly banned. I want to give you guys a chance to say anything, any closing statements regarding aggro decks and Flesh and Blood before we hop onto. I have a question that I want to get the answer to, which is what would you play in a Living Legend calling if it was tomorrow? And Hayden, I know you've made some hints, but I would like to get Tariq's thoughts as well. So anything in closing statements in regards to aggro decks and Flesh and Blood?
No, I think I've said them all. I like aggro decks. I think they're a healthy part of the game. They're a good way of being proactive too. It's nice to have a proactive strategy when you're going to a tournament. Just to say, even if I don't know 100% what the metagame is going to be, it's nice to have a proactive, aggressive strategy. All I would say is that I prefer it more when the decisions are in both players' hands rather than a unilateral gameplay experience.
Basically that. Zen's my least favorite aggro deck we've had in Flesh and Blood, I think.
It is a very recent one. I mean, I think there's been...
You can talk about recency bias, but I just think I've played a lot of those. I've enjoyed playing a lot of these other aggro decks, like Lexi, like Briar, like Chain, even Fire to an extent. Yeah, even Fire to an extent. But yeah, I find Zen.
All right. Living Legend calling tomorrow. What are you locking in?
I want to hit Tariq. What are you locking in, Tariq?
Yeah, what are you locking in?
Starvo, actually. I'm like midway building my Starvo deck. It's actually right here. I don't have my the Quicken token boots, but I'm sleeving it up for skirmish season. And I think people are sleeping on Starvo a little bit. One, obviously it's going to get a lot better with the new set, but even before the new set, I think its Prism matchup is a lot better than people actually think it is. It didn't lose too much in the Prism matchup because even before I was boarding out a lot of my generic threats and kind of boarding into like 57 elements and Oakenolds, and the deck functionally looks relatively similar. So I think the Prism matchup is still fine. I think it actually has game against Zen, because Crush the Weak is a hell of a card. You have enough on hits to kind of trade, and you have quite a fridge to kind of block with as well. So I actually really like Starvo, and I'm probably going to play Starvo during skirmish season. I know people have said you have to play Zen, blah blah blah, but I'm playing Starvo.
Oh, that's interesting. It's not what I expected.
Yeah,
I would like to play Starvo, to be honest. But I would probably lock in Chain. I think Chain feels like the most kind of adaptable, potentially not so much breakable, but I think there's a lot of cool things you can do, and there's some things that I think are undiscovered with that deck at the moment. So I think Chain's pretty interesting. I don't know. I'm struggling with the Zen matchup, honestly, as Chain. I feel like I'm pretty good into everything else. Like I've worked out game plans or builds I want to play into everything else, but the Zen matchup, I don't know. Just the damage is just too good. I don't really know. There's not really much Chain can do about it, unfortunately. You only get so much value at the end of the game, but you have to survive. And Zen also gets better through turns 4 and 5 because of bonds. So
this is where having a large card pool, I think, is really interesting, because sometimes we often think as players we have to ban and do certain things and kind of manipulate it ourselves. But what happens if it works out? Like, let's say I'm right and Starvo just has a really good Zen matchup, and all of a sudden Starvo becomes popular. That would then incentivize, reasons to play Chain over Zen. Like, although your Zen matchup's a lot worse, your Chain v Starvo matchup is actually pretty good. I think Starvo's worst matchup, if you ask me, it wouldn't actually be Prism. I would not like to play against a Briar deck. Yeah. I think Briar is a lot worse of a matchup for Starvo than Prism is, funny enough. But it's funny. I could see a world where maybe Starvo's actually good against Zen. That makes Runeblades a lot better in Living Legend. And I think having, so many powerful decks, so many powerful cards to have access to is what makes it fun. Like, I'm genuinely interested in Living Legend right now, and I'm looking forward to, I think it's Chicago, right? The calling that's Living Legend. So I'm actually genuinely looking forward to it in a couple of months.
I would love to see that. I'd love to see, the format evolve. It'd be great.
All right. Well, Tariq, we appreciate you coming on the pod. Multiple time guests. I want to give you a chance to shout out where people can find you if you're up to anything in particular. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Just Twitter, really. I've kind of stepped away from content. I'm living life right now. I'm kind of loving life right now. In the midst of, I'm playing a lot of golf. I shit the bed at my club championships, so I'm not club champion this year. I played awful. But no, I'm still enjoying it. So I bought a house recently in Florida, kind of back and forth. But I'm just kind of living life. If you want to hear my opinions, you can follow me at Twitter at TP10 or Tariq Patel 10. So you can find me there.
Sweet. Well, if you listen to this podcast, you enjoy it, the number one thing you can do is leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Video version of this on YouTube at youtube.com/@ArsenalPass. Twitter's UrbanAPG, at Fien_Dale, and Tariq just said his. Usually I have the overlaid reference, but my goldfish brain has already lost it, so anyway, special shout out to all the Arsenal Pass patrons. You help us do what we do, and thank you all so much for listening. We will see you next week.